Okay, there we go. Okay, so what am I going to present today? So I'm going to present, I know that the talk was advertised as Non-Democratic Roots of Education. That's the title of one of my articles. And what I'm going to present today builds a little bit on that article, but it's also going to be broader, encompassing the article that Barbara mentioned won a recent award. And most importantly, a book that I have coming out with Princeton University Press in November of this year. And the title of the book is Raised to Obey, The Rise and Spread of Mass Education. So what's the motivation behind this book and much of my research? When we look at the landscape of education systems around the world, and particularly thinking of primary education or elementary education, big picture facts that we know is that most countries around the world, including low-income countries, have done a terrific job in terms of expanding access to primary education, such that virtually all countries today have universal access to primary education. And public primary education is a core feature of essentially all modern states. So that's on one hand, the good news. And then the other fact that we also know is that a lot of education systems are doing a really bad job at actually teaching basic skills. So one stark figure to put this in perspective is that 1/3 of children who have 4 years of schooling, so they've been in school for 4 years, cannot read a single sentence. And this problem of low skills, despite the presence of high access, has led to a lot of interest in the international development community trying to figure out what's at the root of this problem. And I worked, as Barbara mentioned, at the World Bank before. And from that experience there, kind of the type of discourse that I heard when I was at the World Bank is that at the center of this so-called learning crisis, or the problem of low skills, is the fact that politicians, despite being well-intended and wanting to promote skills, do not know how to actually promote skills. That what we have is a problem of ignorance about what are technically the right education policies that we should adopt in order to promote skills. And because of that diagnosis that the problem lies in ignorance, the World Bank has been really pushing for more research, in particular experimental research or randomized controlled trials of education interventions, to identify clearly the types of education policies that do promote learning and the ones that don't, and then to disseminate that research with the underlying assumption that if you tell governments this works, then governments will go ahead and adopt and improve their education policies and adopt the ones that actually promote learning of skills and put away the ones that don't. This type of approach of thinking about the problem being one of ignorance on the part of policymakers is one that has been very heavily influenced by the work of Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, whom you may have heard. They are both incredible economists who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, and they have been really the pioneers of bringing experimental research into the social sciences, and they wrote a book called Poor Economics, in which they lay out this argument, and they say very explicitly that the problem of poverty and poor health outcomes, poor education outcomes, lies in the ignorance on the part of policymakers who are well-intentioned but just don't know what's the best decisions to make. My research questions this assumption. And what my research does is, instead of focusing on current education policies as the potential reason why we have a problem, what I do is, in my research, and particularly in the book that I'm talking about today, is I take a historical approach, meaning I go back in time to the period when governments decided to take charge of primary education. They decided that primary education would no longer, or the education of children of primary school age, would no longer be left entirely to families or to churches or to local communities, that the state would have an important role to play in the education of children. And what I do is I go back to that moment in time and I ask, what drove governments to do this? What were the goals that they were pursuing? Were they pursuing an interest in promoting the skills of the population for whatever reason? or were there a different set of goals that were guiding the creation, the design, and the expansion of primary school systems? And I can tell you as a preview that it was a different set of goals. It wasn't about promoting skills that guided the creation of the systems. But before we get into the argument, one thing that I want to kind of lay out a little bit is when we look at the history of mass education systems in human history, these are relatively recent systems, 200 years old, roughly, depending on which country you're in. They might be a little older, a little bit more recent. But starting roughly in the 19th century, what we had were two big transformations of the educational landscape that took place. The first of those was that states, as I was saying earlier, started to regulate primary education. So instead of just leaving everything to parents and to churches, states started to say, we're going to determine what kind of curriculum you need to teach, what content children need to learn. We're going to determine who can teach children, who the teachers are going to be, how they need to be trained, how they need to be certified. We're going to inspect those systems. We're going to, in some cases, require compulsory attendance to these primary schools. So regulation, that sort of the state's regulation and intervention in primary education, that's something that began in the 19th century. And what I want to show you here with this graph is that where you see here is across time, starting in 1800 all the way to the present, the proportion of countries where the government intervenes in primary education split into two different groups: the proportion of countries in Europe and the Americas that are where the central government is intervening in primary education, and the proportion of countries in the rest of the world where the central government is intervening in primary education. And the simple points that I want to make here is for you to see that this move toward state regulation of primary education was led by Europe and the Americas. It began in Western Europe, then it spread to the United States and Canada, then it spread to Latin America, and the rest of the world followed considerably later. So that's on the regulation. The other big important transformation that took place was that states promoted expansion of access to primary education. So they didn't just pass laws saying this is the curriculum that should be taught and this is how teachers should be trained and recruited, et cetera, et cetera. They put in a lot of effort into building schools, recruiting teachers, printing textbooks, and everything that needs to go into creating a mass education system that can reach vast proportions of the population. And again, on this front, in terms of expanding access to primary education, Europe and the Americas led that expansion compared to the rest of the world. You can see this here. So here we have this line. What we're showing here on the y-axis is primary school enrollment as a proportion of the population ages 5 to 14 years. You can see Europe already starts kind of high in the early 19th century. That's because states in Europe inherit a lot of the provision that had taken place typically under Protestantism, and then they do start expanding and reach universal primary education earlier. This graph doesn't reach 100% because this is as a proportion of 5 to 14-year-olds, and there are a lot of 12, 13, or 14-year-olds that are already in secondary school, so they're not in primary school, and that's why this doesn't reach 100%. But Europe takes the lead, particularly Prussia within Europe, and I'll come back to Prussia later. The United States and Canada catch up starting in the mid-19th century, and that's not depicted here, but if you had the United States, it would kind of catch up starting around 1850 with Europe. In the early 19th century, the US was behind Western Europe. And then the other line you see here, this graph, this line that's moving a lot, the dashed black line, that's Latin America. And you can compare Latin American primary school enrollment rates with this other dotted line here, which is primary school enrollment rates in the rest of the developing world. So Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, Asia, etc. And the point here to show is that Latin America expands access to primary education much sooner and reaches universal primary education much earlier than the rest of the developing world. So we have a pattern where the Western societies of Europe and the Americas are leading this global transformation of increased state regulation and increased state promotion of access to primary education. And the talk today is going to focus on explaining why, what's happening that's leading these states to take care of primary education. Now, what I'm going to do by looking at history is answer a set of questions. When and why do states in these Western societies decide to regulate and promote primary education? What's their main goal? How do they design these systems in order to accomplish their goals? And what are the legacies of these systems? And one thing that I want to stress from the get-go is I'm going to talk a lot about the social control goals of these schools. And I want to clarify that I'm not making a normative argument here. My questions are not about what should schools do or what should be the goals of primary education, because I have no doubt that primary education and education generally should be something that serves as a vehicle to empower people and to transform their lives and enable them to flourish. But that's not what we're going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about today is what did governments want out of education? And we're going to see a big disjoint between what we might want governments to invest in education for versus what governments actually wanted to get out of these mass education systems. So as we think about this history of mass education systems and trying to understand what's behind them, whatever story we tell about why these systems came into existence is going to have to be consistent with a number of facts that I've documented in some of my research. And one of those facts is that in Europe and Latin America, the emergence of public primary education systems takes place well before the spread of democracy, well before these countries become democratic for the first time. So that is shown here on this graph, where you have for Western European and Latin American countries, 2 dots per country. The black dot shows you when each country begins to regulate comprehensively primary education by passing a comprehensive primary education law that regulates a number of things, including the curriculum, teacher training and recruitment, inspections, and so on. So that's going to be this black dot. And then the hollow dot is going to be when does each country transition to democracy for the first time? They might then have democratic collapse and a later democracy. But what we're looking at here is the first transition to democracy. And the big thing you can see here is the black dot precedes the hollow dot by a long by many years. On average, across European and Latin American countries, central governments begin to regulate primary education 100 years before they first transition to democracy. So the spread of democracy is not going to help us understand why these countries led the rest of the world in regulating primary education. We're going to need an explanation that is consistent with the fact that mass education systems were a non-democratic invention. The other thing that I also want to show you is that it's not just that non-democratic regimes in Europe and Latin America regulated education systems and primary education by passing laws. They also made considerable efforts well before the spread of the arrival of democracy to expand access to primary education. And what you have here is average primary school enrollment rates, now as a percentage of the entire school-age population, in the 20 years before and the 20 years after democratization for European and Latin American countries on average. And the only thing that I want to emphasize from this graph is that for both Europe and Latin America, before you transition to democracy, countries have reached on average around 70% of enrollment rates in primary education. So a large portion of the population is already enrolled in primary school before countries become democratic. And again, that's what we need, a theory that can account for that, that can help us understand why that's the case. So if we take a step back and look at the wealth of knowledge we've inherited and the theories that have been put out there for why governments provide education, one of the most important paradigms out there is that governments provide mass education in an effort to promote skills. And economists would call this in an effort to promote the accumulation of human capital. So there can be different things that prompt governments to do this. One could be, for example, a government becomes democratic and wants to win elections. And in order to do that, they need to cater to the demands of the population. And the population wants more access to education, and therefore the government responds by doing that. So democratization could be one thing that leads a government to expand skills. You could also have a government, democratic or non-democratic, that, by the way, just as I previewed, democratization is not going to help us much because of what I said earlier, that the expansion takes place primarily preceding democratization. Another possibility is that governments want to promote skills in an effort to promote industrialization. And this could be democratic or non-democratic countries. The Soviet Union did a lot of expansion of primary education in an effort to support the rapid industrialization that it wanted to accomplish. And so the question is, to what extent does that experience from the Soviet Union generalize across a larger group of countries? And in particular, does it help explain why the Western societies of Europe and the Americas led the rest of the world in creating mass education systems? And the answer is going to be no, that it doesn't really help us explain much. Another possibility is that governments are expanding mass education again to promote skills, but not so much to promote industrialization or social mobility. They're doing it primarily so that they can have a really good army that's going to win against other states whenever they have to fight in interstate wars. So that's another possibility. We're also going to see evidence against that as a very important explanation. And then we move on to a second class of arguments that are positing not that mass education systems seek to promote skills, but rather that governments are investing in mass education as a means of social control, using education to shape the political values and behaviors of the masses. Within this second class of arguments is where my argument is going to fit in, and where my research and the evidence I've gathered supports. But it's going to differ from the main type of argument within this social control class of arguments. So the main argument that people have put out there is an argument of mass education being used for nation building purposes. So trying to teach everyone to believe that they share a national identity, that we're all Americans, or we're all Argentine, or we're all Peruvian, or we're all whatever country we choose, that we're in this together, that we should stick together, that we should volunteer for the army when we have a war with another country, and so on and so forth. And as part of this nation building effort, schools, presumably, one of the key things that they're doing is promoting a common national identity and a common national language. So these are kind of two important markers of a nation building agenda. And multiple different things could trigger this nation building agenda. It could be, for example, interstate wars that lead governments to not necessarily just want a skilled army that can win, but also loyal soldiers, people who are going to be really invested in their country winning, and they're going to put in more effort to fight against foreign countries, and also patriotic citizens who are going to resist foreign countries' efforts to try to get them to desert to the other country. So there's a number of different things that could lead to potentially nation-building efforts through mass education. Another common one that people talk about are immigration waves, where suddenly the host country that's receiving a lot of immigrants is concerned about the cultural lack of assimilation of the new immigrants, and they're turning to education to try to infuse in them national values. I'm going to make an argument that's different from this nation-building argument. What I'm going to argue is that at the origin of these public primary education systems, the main goal was not one of nation building. In fact, multiple languages were allowed, multiple religions could be taught in school. There wasn't necessarily an effort to teach people that they were German or French or Argentine or whatever. But what was present in all systems was an effort to instill obedience and an effort to instill quote unquote good moral values. And good meant essentially obedience to the law, obedience to authority, respect for authority. And what I'm going to show you is that this interest in what I call state building, because it's about respect for the law and respect for the state's authority. That's essentially what mass education is trying to instill at first. This agenda is particularly triggered by the presence of internal conflict that creates among the rulers of a country, the elites, heightened fear and anxiety about the masses and their violent predispositions. And suddenly they're thinking of these people, the lower classes, as savages or animals. We'll come back to this, but people who are dangerous, not just to the stability of the state that they're trying to consolidate, but also to their own lives, the elite's own lives. There's a fear of being killed that's driving a lot of these efforts to put people in schools and teach them how to behave and how to behave well. So in a nutshell, what I'm going to show you evidence for, and I'll obviously show you just a very small snippet of the evidence that's in the book, is an argument, evidence for an argument that the main reason driving primary education is this state building goal to consolidate the authority of a central ruler, a central government. And the idea behind education is that what schools are going to do is they're not going to stop whoever's rebelling right now from rebelling. We need to do something else with the people who are rebelling right now. But what schools are going to do is they're going to target children and teach them from a very young age to respect rules and authorities, such that in the long term, we're going to prevent social disorder by preventing future citizens from rebelling against the state. As I said earlier, when is this indoctrination, what I call an indoctrination agenda, and I'll come back to why I use that term. So bear with me, because I know it's a controversial term for some of you potentially. But this indoctrination agenda is going to become particularly activated when there's perceived or real internal conflicts that heightens elite fears of the masses and of the masses' violent behavior. So democratization, industrialization, military rivalry, these three different alternative explanations have much less predictive power in terms of explaining the expansion of primary education, and I'll show you evidence for that. And as I was previewing earlier, when we see expansions of primary education, we're going to see that that's preceded by concerns among rulers that if we don't take care of these people through schools, they're going to continue being morally flawed. They're going to continue being savages and unruly and barbarian. They're going to continue being bloodthirsty hordes and criminals and etc., etc. These are the types of words that I've put here, extracted from the debates that existed among elites during the period when they were debating the creation of public primary education systems in numerous European, the US and Latin American countries. The words that they used to describe the people who needed to be educated and why they needed to be educated. How are they going to do this? How are they going to try to accomplish this goal of moralizing the masses and instilling a sense of obedience and discipline in them? Well, what governments are going to do is they're going to regulate heavily the curriculum and who can become a teacher and school inspection, all designed with the goal of trying to promote these good moral values and obedience among citizens. So the emphasis of curriculums and the emphasis of who can become a teacher and so on, it's not going to be on skills. It's going to be on recruiting morally good teachers or instilling good moral values in the teachers. And the curriculum is not going to focus on teaching skills. It's going to focus again on instilling moral values. And likewise, it's not going to focus initially on instilling nationalism. That's something that will definitely become an important part of the primary school curriculum, but later on in time in many countries, not at the outset. legacies and why this is important, because a lot of the design that of these systems persists to this day. So think about, and this is why I have this aversion to lecturing style. We've inherited this system where our classes are set up in rows where the students sit facing the teacher and the class is teacher-centered, and our students are taking notes frenetically as if what we say is the word of God and cannot be contested, and they need to memorize everything we say. We've inherited this system from that 19th century goal of teaching people to accept certain truths and certain beliefs uncritically, as opposed to designing these systems in a way that will encourage and promote critical thinking. And the other legacy, or rather, this is not a legacy, but the relevance of the argument in current contexts is I'll talk briefly about some more contemporary cases where what we see is the same thing we've seen in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. It's turning to education in order to indoctrinate and to try to accomplish social control goals in response to periods of domestic conflict that heighten elites' fear of the masses. And particularly, one thing that I'll talk about is this recent last 2 years of K through 12 curriculum reforms across the United States that did not coincidentally happen to take place immediately after the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020. So we'll get to that later. But let me just first say how I'm using the term indoctrination. So sometimes people talk about indoctrination, and what they mean is communist brainwashing or fascist brainwashing, and that's not how I'm going to use the term. I'm going to use this term in the way that it's defined in the dictionary, which is, here you can see, the process of teaching a person or group to accept a set of beliefs uncritically. And the focus here is on the process being about uncritical acceptance, trying to instill this unquestioned respect for a set of beliefs, not on the content of the beliefs. So one can indoctrinate children to believe that the absolutist king deserves full respect. And one can also indoctrinate children to believe that democracy is the best possible system in the world. So the content per se is not what defines indoctrination in the way that I and many others use the term. What makes something indoctrination or not is whether the way in which these beliefs are being taught allow for critical thinking, or whether these things are being taught in a way that is really about instilling this without allowing for critical thinking and questioning of these things and putting these things to the test, both logically and empirically. So here's the outline for the rest of today's talk. I'm going to talk about ideas for mass education that floated around during the Enlightenment, and how internal conflict gave political traction to these ideas, first in Prussia and then in many other countries. And today I'll just talk briefly about France, Argentina, and Chile if I have time, how the systems were designed, what indoctrination looks like today and in democratic contexts, so not just non-democratic, and then some final thoughts. So ideas about mass education. If we look at the Enlightenment, we might get the sense that during the Enlightenment, we have this period where people are starting to think of education as something that can empower people or enable them to be more rational thinkers. And there's a lot to say for that understanding of the Enlightenment as it applies to how people thought of secondary and university education. But the main Enlightenment philosophers, when it came to mass education, they had a very different idea about what mass education was supposed to do. And here there was ample agreement from Hobbes to Rousseau to Kant to Locke that mass education should teach moral principles and inculcate obedience to the sovereign and the sovereign's rules as part of the state's interest and its function to preserve social order and prevent civil strife. So in Hobbes, for example, one of the things that he talks about is how it is so I'll just quote here from Hobbes. He says, the instruction of the people in the essential rights of the sovereign, so teaching people about the rights that the sovereign has to do a number of things and to pass laws and to regulate your lives, is not only the sovereign's duty, but also a benefit to the sovereign, because this education provides security against the danger that would otherwise arise from rebellion against the sovereign. So that's kind of his logic about why the state has an interest in promoting mass education. Rousseau, who we might all think of as being a liberal thinker, had very similar ideas in this realm to Hobbes. So Rousseau says, to form citizens is not the business of a single day. To have them be citizens when they are men, they have to be taught when they are children. And then he says, in as much as there are laws for adulthood, there should also be laws for childhood that teach obedience to others. And in as much as each man's reason is not left to the sole judge of his duties, the education of children ought all the less to be left to their fathers' lights and prejudices, because that education matters to the state even more than it does to the father. So essentially, he's saying we need to teach children to be obedient, to obey others, and the state needs to take charge of this, because this obedience matters to the state more so than to anyone else in society. These ideas that floated around, and today, I mean, obviously giving you very few quotes on this, but there was ample agreement about this role of education in promoting obedience to the state and to the state's laws and rules among Enlightenment philosophers, and also among pietist reformers, particularly within Prussia. And so here's a quote from a pietist reformer. So this is kind of a branch within Protestantism that became really, really important in the 18th century in Prussia. And they say the teacher's task is to break the child's will. The schoolmaster who seeks to make the child more learned had forgotten his most important task, which is making the will obedient. So again, you can see kind of this convergence of thought between pietist reformers. Franke was perhaps kind of the leading one in the realm of pietist thoughts on education specifically. So a convergence between pietist reform and Enlightenment philosophers' ideas on what's the role that education should play. And this becomes prevalent starting in the 18th century, and particularly becomes really the type of idea that circulates among political rulers in the 19th century. So when we think today, mass education is about promoting social mobility, mass education is about promoting skills, that was not the way people conceived of mass education at that time. It wasn't the way that they thought of mass education. And if anybody ever brought up that possibility, what political rulers did was they rejected that. They would explicitly say mass education should not promote social mobility. We need to teach people to accept the rules as they are and their place in society as it is, and prevent them from aspiring to more. So these ideas themselves, they were not enough to generate mass education systems, because the ideas floated around for a while before they actually led states to invest in mass education. The reason for that is mass education, people thought, well, it will have these benefits if we create it in terms of more obedience, more respect for the state, more political order, political stability, social order. But it also comes with a lot of costs, because the state suddenly is going to have to create all these schools and recruit all these teachers and pay them salaries and print textbooks. And it's a whole infrastructure and a whole big chunk of funds that need to be devoted. And so for a while, states in the various different countries think like, we're not going to do this. What leads them to change their mind, what leads political rulers to change their mind, is the occurrence of episodes of internal conflict that involve mass violence against the state, that lead political rulers to become really fearful of the masses and what the masses can do, not just in terms of overthrowing a regime, but ultimately putting in danger the entire enterprise of creating a state, and also the potential ability to kill elites. So this internal conflict is something that's going to bring elites together around mass education proposals. And conservatives and liberals are going to coalesce during these periods of internal conflict around ideas for the creation of a public primary education system. And Prussia is going to be the country that leads the way. It's going to be the country that introduces compulsory schooling and creates a national primary education system that becomes the example for the rest of the world, and not just for other non-democratic regimes. Prussia is an absolutist regime in the period when it's going to do this. But Prussia is going to become a model for other countries, including the United States as well. So people are going to see Prussia and start sending officials to Prussia and try to learn from what Prussia is doing in the realm of education. And this has to do with the fact that Prussia in the 18th century transitioned from being a backward country to a world power. So people want to understand how did Prussia do that? And one of the things that they're noticing is that Prussia is the only country that has a massive state-regulated primary education system. And so they're going to attribute the strength of the state to the state's ability to forge social order within its territory. And they're going to want to learn from that experience. So they're going to send these officials to learn from Prussia. And so because the Prussian experience becomes so important for the history of primary education, I want to give you just a brief idea of how Prussian rulers and education reformers thought of the goals of mass education. I'm going to come back to this. So this is a quote that comes from an education advisor to Frederick the Great. So just a little bit of preview on this. Prussia introduces compulsory schooling and a comprehensive law, essentially, for regulating primary schools in 1763. And that happens under Frederick the Great. And the reason why it happens, so already in 1754, Frederick had signed a very similar decree with the same kind of education regulation, but they couldn't implement it because the 7 Years War kicked in. So they waited until 1763 and they tweaked that reform a little bit, but it was essentially very similar to the 1754. And why did we have that education law in 1754? It had to do with this period of peasant revolts that occurred in the 1740s and 1750s, in which peasants were essentially rebelling against the landlords. There was essentially a breakdown of the feudal structure, and the peasants no longer felt compelled to work for their new landlords. There had been a lot of turnover in land ownership. That was one of the things that was contributing to this erosion of a sense of duty to the landlords. Doesn't really matter what the precise reasons were, but the big point is that we had these peasant revolts, and the king realized that the landlords no longer had this ability to control the peasants. And so the king needed to do something. And the first thing that the king did was to introduce agrarian reform, to try to appease these peasants, to give them some concessions through agrarian reforms so that they would be a little happier. But the king's advisors told the king, and the king obviously also knew this, the appeasement on its own is not going to be sufficient, because nothing is going to prevent them from wanting more in the future and asking for more, even if we give them something today. And so what the king's education advisors proposed, in part because of this inheritance of pietist thought being prevalent in Prussia, was to use education as a way to instill obedience and respect for the king's rule. And so here's an example of the kinds of things that, in this case, Felbiger, the king's education advisor, told him. He said, "Human beings are by nature moved by kindness and reason rather than force. Despotic methods will not induce pupils to obey. The students must be convinced that it's useful and correct to follow the schoolmaster's wishes. Only then will they learn to obey, even in situations where force is absent." So we need to teach them to obey from a young age, so that when they become adults, they've become used to being obedient. and they will continue to obey without our need to repress them. So that's where the where force is absent comes from. And by doing this, by instilling a sense of obedience, the schoolmaster accomplishes his most important task, which is that his pupils will observe their duties not only in school, but throughout their lives. So this is the type of rationale that underlied the creation of a compulsory primary school system in Prussia, and the kind of rationale that then diffused to other countries. But as I was saying earlier, the diffusion of these ideas alone was insufficient to trigger investments in mass education, and the occurrence of internal conflict that creates this big fear of the masses among elites. It's a key factor that drives the expansion of mass education. And you can see this in one way through this graph, which is showing you on average across European and Latin American countries from over this long period, 1828 to 2010, how are primary school enrollment rates evolving before and after civil wars, with civil war being just one example of a type of internal conflict that has mass violence. And I'm focusing here only on civil wars that involve mass violence against the state. So if there's interethnic groups that are fighting, but the state is not involved, those are not included here. These are only civil wars with mass violence against the state. And what you see from this graph is a pattern across countries that we would also see if we broke this down by multiple kind of country by country. But I'm aggregating this to show you some general patterns. A relatively stable trend before a civil war occurs in terms of access to primary education. And then after a civil war emerges, a big increase in primary education enrollment and access to primary education following civil wars. Of course, this could be driven by a number of possibilities, and it could be, well, the state is responding to the threat of the posed by the masses by providing education for social control purposes. It could also be something else. It could be the rebels want education, and the state is responding to the rebels' demands by providing that education. So I'm gonna do a lot to tease out which of these two explanations explains why this is happening. And essentially the evidence points consistently to it's about social control, it's not about appeasing rebels. And the other thing that I also want to point about the importance of internal conflict is what I mentioned earlier, which is that when we look at internal conflict, this is the same graph I was showing you before of primary school enrollment rates before and after Civil War. And what we have here are similar graphs showing you access to primary education before and after democratization, before and after industrialization, and before and after interstate wars. And what you see here for democratization is there's no change in the trend. So democratization doesn't seem to accelerate, the occurrence of democratization doesn't seem to accelerate the expansion of primary education. It was increasing before, it's continuing to increase after at the same rate. Very much in contrast to the pattern we see with internal conflict. For industrialization, what we see is similarly not much change in the trend before and after either the beginning of the first industrial revolution or the beginning of the second industrial revolution. And for interstate wars, what we actually see is there is this expansion in Europe and the Americas of primary school enrollment rates after the occurrence of an interstate war, but that expansion is purely a rebound from the collapse in enrollment that happens during the Civil War. So it's just a partial recovery. It's not new enrollment, which is in contrast to what happens in the case of internal conflict, where it's leading to an expansion of primary education above and beyond what we would have seen in the absence of the Civil War. So the bottom line to convey through these graphs is that internal conflict is a stronger predictor of the expansion of primary education than democratization, industrialization, or interstate wars. And I explained a little bit why that's the case, but there's evidence from many different countries of this pattern of ideas were floating around about education being potentially good to maintain social order, but it's only once an internal conflict occurs that elites decide to act on these ideas and implement them. So in the book, I provide evidence from the United States during the early Republic and England in 1870 and Peru after 2000. And there's a whole range of different examples that I provide. Some of the examples are also France in 1833, Argentina in 1884, and Chile in 1860. These years correspond in each case to the first comprehensive primary education law that is adopted. And each of these laws in France, Argentina, Chile lead to rapid expansion afterwards of access to primary education. And what turns out to be the commonality across these cases, there's a lot of differences between them. France was a monarchy, Argentina was an oligarchy led by liberals in the sense of being anti-church. Chile was an oligarchy led by conservatives who were pro-church. So a lot of different contexts. But the commonality is that each one of these foundational primary education laws are being preceded by a period of internal conflict that exacerbates elite fears of the masses. So in France, this is happening immediately after the July monarchy comes to power. There's a period of 2 years where there's intense violence, particularly in the south of France, which is a rural area, where there was a really bad harvest, and people are blaming the government and destroying granaries and destroying tax collection offices and engaging in all kinds of violence against the state. In Argentina, what we have is a longer time period after Argentina becomes independent. This should not be 1840s, so this should be 1820s to 1880s, and I apologize for that mistake. So after Argentina becomes independent, there's essentially a 6-decade period of intermittent civil wars between Buenos Aires elites who want to consolidate the power of the state in Buenos Aires and elites from what we call the interior of the country, so other provinces outside Buenos Aires, who want a more equal distribution of authority across the different provinces, not so concentrated in Buenos Aires. And there's this intermittent civil war that lasts roughly 6 decades. And then in Chile, what we have is a civil war in 1859. So each of these cases is preceded by important levels of internal conflict. And what we see is, as this internal conflict is unfolding and in the aftermath of this internal conflict, rulers and elites and education reformers try to convince other elites about the importance of investing in education in an effort to prevent future episodes of internal conflict from emerging again by teaching children to be obedient and to stay put, essentially. So here's an example of what Guizot, who's the Minister of Education of France in 1833, when France passes its first comprehensive education law, says about the rationale for investing in mass education. And one particularly important or interesting, rather, thing about Guizot is that during the period, so he became Minister of Education in 1833, but in the previous years, under 1830 to 1832, he had been Minister of the Interior. So he was the one who kind of tried to keep order within the periphery or outside of Paris as all of these social unrest was taking place, and had failed to do so. And one of the things that he found was that the National Guard, who was supposed to be repressing these people who were rebelling, would not do so. They would just stand there and be passive and let them do, in part because they shared the same economic grievances that people were protesting about, being hungry and prices of food being excessively high and so on. And so he learned from that experience about the limitations of just relying on repression to try to maintain social order. And when he becomes Minister of Education, he really pushes through Parliament this first comprehensive primary education law. And later, when he reflects on why he did that, he says, when men have learned from childhood to understand the fundamental laws of the country and to respect its sovereign, the sovereign and the laws become a kind of dear property, and they do not refuse the obligations that it imposes upon them. Thus, the public mind is formed, thus a true patriotism is maintained, thus fortifying and consolidating society's anthrones. We have a similar set of arguments if we look at Argentina. After this period of civil wars, people are reflecting on what needs to happen in order to prevent that from happening again. And rulers in Buenos Aires say the Argentine Republic needs to repel the desert's barbarism. And by this, they're talking about the barbarism of the rural masses in the interior of the country. So the state in Buenos Aires needs to repel the desert's barbarism and has managed through its army to reduce it to relatively narrow regions. But in those regions, it urgently needs to also reduce the barbaric elements of society through an army of teachers who know how to teach, educating the moral nature of the children so that schools serve effectively to prevent crime and consolidate domestic peace. And lastly, in the case of Chile, after the 1859 Civil War, we see a very similar set of arguments where people are blaming the Civil War that just took place on the lack of morality among the masses. And this comes from the president of Chile, speaking a month after the end of the 1859 Civil War. The year later, he was able to get this first primary education law passed by parliament, but he tells people a large part of the evils that affect the public order and the process of civil war we just went through are rooted in ignorance, extirpating it through a system of common schools that enlightens the masses by correcting their bad manners is the most urgent task that Congress can devote itself to. I'm not necessarily going to go over these different graphs. I leave that to the curious members of the audience who want to read the book. But one of the things that I show in the book is that in line with what we would expect from this argument, when governments create these laws and then start expanding primary education, they target their efforts to expand primary education particularly to those areas or regions of the country that had rebelled against the state, because those are the ones that are perceived to be particularly threatening to the stability of the state. The other thing that I also look at, as I mentioned earlier, is how are they designing these systems aside from passing laws? What does the content of these laws look like? So I analyzed the content of the 25 laws, of the first laws passed in 25 European and Latin American countries, and focusing specifically on comprehensive education laws that are regulating multiple things like the curriculum, teachers' certification requirements, and so on. And what we see consistently is this effort through these different policy devices, regulation of the curriculum, regulation of teachers, to promote moral education. So essentially, all curriculums have an emphasis on moral education as a standalone subject, and then moral education infused in the teaching of reading and writing. And then you also get some arithmetic, but arithmetic is taught sort of, these subjects are being taught in order. So moral education comes first, sequentially, I mean. Moral education comes first, then reading, then writing. And if you're still in school, after you've learned all of these, then you'll get some basic arithmetic. Whereas in these first primary education laws, they tend not to have natural science or geometry and algebra or social studies or physical education. Social studies is one that we would expect if there was an effort to promote nation building. And within reading and writing, what we would also expect if there was an effort to promote nation building is an effort to impose or inculcate a common language. And we don't see that nearly as often as we see an emphasis on moral education. We can see moral education throughout the entire structure of the school and in the way that reading and writing are being taught. So here's just one example of the textbooks that were being used in Chile to teach kids reading. So this is not from their moral education class, this is from their reading class. But in that reading class, the material that they're reading tells them, if you are a subject, you must obey and behave well, and must not judge your superiors based on what you see. They have aims you may not understand. And they also teach children, if I am happy with what my parents give me to eat and drink, if I am nice to others, I will sow the seeds of my good behavior. If I behave well and satisfy God when I die, I will go to heaven. So there's this infusion of moral messages, not just in Chile, but around. different countries. So these efforts to instill obedience are still present around education systems today. And as I mentioned, it's kind of embedded in the way that schools around the world in most countries are designed, the classroom setup in particular. One of the things that I did with a team of researchers in Europe was to gather data, cross-national data from 160 countries on the prevalence of indoctrination in education systems from 1945 to 2021. Within that, what I ended up doing was to look at the prevalence of indoctrination, comparing democracies versus autocracies. And I don't want you to focus too much on these graphs because I think it's gonna take away from it'll take me time to go over them. But the bottom line, what we see is that there's a similar amount of effort in democracies and autocracies in terms of promoting a specific set of beliefs to justify a particular social and political order. Almost all democracies and almost all autocracies, through their history curriculum today, are making an effort to promote a specific set of beliefs that justify a particular social and political order. But what's very dramatically between them is what is the social and political order that they're trying to support or promote. In democracies, it's a democratic social and political order, whereas in autocracies, it's much less common that they're trying to promote a democratic social and political order, as you would expect. The other thing that we also found is that in democracies, we do have more effort to teach critical thinking or to allow critical thinking when students are being taught history than in autocracies. But even within democracies, it's still a relatively low amount of critical thinking. Or put another way, there's still a lot of room for promoting more critical thinking within democracies. So I'll end with just a few final thoughts, and these are questions that I think are important questions that emerge from this research. One is, what should be the balance between indoctrination and critical thinking in liberal democracies? And related to this question, does promoting a critical thinking produce political instability, or does it not? Does indoctrination produce social order, or does it not? And when does it, and when does it backfire? And lastly, a question that I'm particularly also really interested in exploring moving forward is the question of what motivates a government to move away from indoctrination and to embrace other goals, like wanting schools to promote social mobility, wanting schools to promote skills. So I'll leave it there, and I really look forward to all of your questions and